I was standing in my kitchen, still wearing my gardening gloves, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my son, Michael. "Mum, Dad's company picnic is Saturday. Please don't talk to my boss if you see him there. You'll just say something embarrassing like you always do." I read it 3 times, my hands trembling slightly. 32 years of raising this boy, putting him through college, supporting his career moves, and this is what I got. A warning to stay quiet because I was apparently too embarrassing to speak to his superior. I set the phone down and stared out my kitchen window at the roses I'd been tending. Those roses had been there when Michael was born, when he took his first steps on the back patio, when he graduated high school. They'd outlasted his father's heart attack 5 years ago, and they were still here while my own son treated me like I was some kind of liability. The text felt like a slap across the face, but what hurt more was realizing this wasn't the first time he'd made me feel this way. Just 2 weeks earlier, at his daughter's birthday party, he'd pulled me aside when I was talking to another parent about my volunteer work at the animal shelter. "Mum, you don't need to tell everyone your whole life story," he'd whispered harshly. "It's embarrassing." I'd spent the rest of that party sitting quietly in a corner, watching my granddaughter play while feeling like an unwanted guest in my own family. The company picnic was supposed to be a family event. Michael worked as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm, and he'd been there for almost 8 years. I'd heard him mention his boss, Richard, countless times over dinner conversations, but I'd never actually met the man. According to Michael, Richard was tough but fair, someone who valued hard work and professionalism above all else. My son had been angling for a promotion to senior project manager for months, and I knew this picnic was important to him. But the way he'd phrased that text message made my blood boil. "Like you always do." Always do what, exactly? Speak my mind? Ask questions? Show interest in the people around me? I'd raised Michael to be confident and articulate, but somewhere along the way, he'd decided that those same qualities in his mother were embarrassing liabilities. I spent the rest of that afternoon replaying conversations in my head, trying to figure out when my son had started seeing me as a source of shame instead of pride. When his father was alive, Michael never treated me this way. David had always encouraged me to speak up, to share my opinions, to engage with the world around us. He'd loved my curiosity about people and my tendency to ask direct questions. "That's my Eleanor," he'd say, when I'd strike up conversations with strangers or challenge someone's assumptions at a dinner party. Michael and I used to be close. After his father died, I thought we'd grown even closer. He'd call me every Sunday, stop by for dinner at least twice a week, and include me in family decisions. But then his wife, Sarah, got that promotion at her marketing firm, and suddenly everything changed. She started working longer hours, traveling more for business, and Michael had to step up at home with their 8-year-old daughter, Emma. The pressure seemed to transform him. He became more focused on appearances, more worried about what other people thought. When Sarah landed a major client last year, they moved to a bigger house in a more expensive neighborhood. Michael started talking differently about his job, about his goals, about what success looked like. He'd always been ambitious, but this felt different. This felt desperate. I remember the first time I really noticed the change. We were at Emma's school carnival, and I was talking to her teacher about the reading program I'd helped organize at the local library. It was nothing unusual, just a conversation between two people who cared about children's education. But Michael appeared at my elbow like he'd been summoned by some invisible alarm. "Mum, we should probably let Miss Patterson get back to the other families," he'd said, his hand firmly on my arm. The teacher had looked confused. We'd been having a perfectly pleasant conversation about encouraging young readers. But Michael had already started steering me away, muttering something about how I didn't need to monopolize people's time. That's when I started paying attention to the pattern. Every social situation became a minefield. If I mentioned my volunteer work, I was bragging. If I asked someone about their job or their family, I was being nosy. If I shared an opinion about current events or community issues, I was being inappropriate or too political. Michael had developed an entire catalogue of my supposed social failures, and he wasn't shy about sharing his critiques. Sarah never said anything directly, but I could feel her watching me at family gatherings, ready to swoop in if I said something she deemed unsuitable. She had this way of changing the subject whenever I started talking about anything substantial, redirecting the conversation to safer topics like the weather or local restaurant reviews. It was subtle, but it was there. The worst part was watching how this affected my relationship with Emma. My granddaughter and I had always been close. I'd taught her to bake cookies, helped her build fairy houses in the backyard, read her stories that sparked long conversations about everything from dinosaurs to space travel. But increasingly, Michael and Sarah would find reasons to cut our visits short or redirect Emma's attention when she asked me questions they deemed inappropriate. Last Christmas, Emma had asked me about why some families didn't have enough money for presents. It was an innocent question from a thoughtful child who'd noticed the charity drives at her school. I'd started to explain about economic inequality in terms she could understand, but Sarah had immediately interrupted. "Grandma Eleanor, let's not worry Emma with such heavy topics," she'd said with a tight smile. Michael had nodded approvingly, and I'd spent the rest of the evening feeling like I'd committed some unforgivable sin by treating my granddaughter like an intelligent human being capable of understanding the world around her. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my career as a high school English teacher, engaging teenagers in discussions about literature, history, and social issues every single day. Parents had trusted me to educate their children, to challenge them intellectually, to help them develop critical thinking skills, but somehow my own son had decided I was too inappropriate to have meaningful conversations with his daughter. Saturday morning arrived grey and overcast, matching my mood perfectly. Michael had texted me the night before with logistics. "Picnic starts at 11 a.m. at Riverside Park. We'll meet you by the pavilion." No warmth, no excitement about spending time together, just basic information delivered like a business memo. I spent an hour getting ready, choosing my outfit carefully. I settled on a navy blue blouse and khaki pants. Professional but not formal, appropriate for a family picnic, but respectable enough for meeting my son's colleagues. I even toned down my usual jewelry, opting for simple pearl earrings instead of the colourful beaded necklaces I preferred. I was determined not to give Michael any ammunition for his embarrassment arsenal. The park was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Michael's company had reserved the large pavilion, and about 50 people were already gathered around picnic tables laden with food. Children ran between the trees, while adults clustered in conversation groups, balancing paper plates and plastic cups. It looked like any typical corporate family event. Pleasant, safe, utterly unremarkable. I spotted Michael near the grills, talking to a group of men in polo shirts and khakis. He saw me approaching and immediately excused himself from the conversation. "Mum, you made it?" he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Food's over there. Drinks are on that table. Sarah's somewhere around here with Emma?" Before I could respond, he'd already started walking back toward his colleagues. The message was clear. Stay in your lane, don't cause any trouble, and definitely don't approach the important people. I felt like a child being given instructions for good behavior at a grown-up party. I loaded a plate with potato salad and a hamburger, found Sarah and Emma at a picnic table with several other families, and settled in for what I assumed would be a perfectly boring afternoon of small talk about school activities and weekend plans. Emma was excited to see me, chattering about her latest art project and asking if I'd brought any new books for her. For a few minutes, I forgot about Michael's warning and just enjoyed spending time with my granddaughter. That's when Richard Martinez approached our table. I recognized him immediately from Michael's descriptions: tall, greying at the temples, with the kind of confident bearing that comes from years in management. He was making rounds through the crowd, stopping at each table to chat with his employees and their families. When he reached us, Sarah immediately straightened up, putting on her most professional smile. "Sarah, good to see you again," he said warmly. "And this must be Emma." He crouched down to my granddaughter's level. "Your dad tells me you're quite the artist." Emma beamed and launched into an enthusiastic description of her latest masterpiece, a drawing of our family dog that she'd been working on for weeks. Richard listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions and genuinely engaging with her 8-year-old perspective. I found myself impressed by his easy manner with children. When Emma finished her explanation, Richard stood up and looked directly at me. "And you must be Michael's mother. I'm Richard Martinez." He extended his hand with a genuine smile. "Michael talks about you all the time." This was it. This was the moment Michael had warned me about. His boss was speaking to me directly, and according to my son's text message, I was supposed to somehow avoid saying anything embarrassing. The weight of that expectation sat heavily on my shoulders as I shook Richard's hand. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Martinez," I said carefully. "Thank you for including families in today's event." Richard waved off the formality. "Please, call me Richard. And it's my pleasure. We're big believers in work-life balance here. Family comes first." He gestured toward the bustling picnic around us. "Events like this help us remember that we're not just colleagues, we're a community." I nodded politely, acutely aware that Michael was probably watching this interaction from across the pavilion. I could feel Sarah's tension beside me, ready to intervene if I strayed into dangerous conversational territory. The safest strategy seemed to be saying as little as possible while remaining polite. But Richard didn't seem interested in moving on to the next table. Instead, he settled into the empty chair across from me, clearly prepared for an actual conversation. "Michael mentioned you were a teacher before you retired." "What subject?" "English literature," I replied, keeping my answer brief. "Ah, a noble profession," Richard said. "My wife was a teacher too, elementary school. She always said teaching was the most important job in the world because you're shaping the next generation." He leaned back in his chair. "What got you interested in literature specifically?" I glanced around the table, looking for an escape route. Sarah was pretending to be absorbed in wiping Emma's hands, but I could see her listening intently. A few tables away, Michael was trying to look casual while obviously monitoring our conversation. The whole situation felt like a test I was destined to fail. "I've always loved books," I said finally, hoping that would be generic enough to satisfy Richard without triggering Michael's embarrassment radar. But Richard's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "What kinds of books? Are you more of a classics person, or do you keep up with contemporary authors too?" The question hung in the air, and I realized I had a choice to make. I could continue with my safe, generic responses and probably bore Richard into moving on to another table. Or I could actually answer him honestly and risk whatever consequences Michael thought might follow. Looking at Richard's face, I saw genuine curiosity and interest. Here was a successful business owner who was taking time out of his company picnic to have a real conversation with an employee's mother. The least I could do was treat him with the same respect by giving him an authentic response. "I try to read widely," I said, feeling some of my natural personality returning. "I love the classics. You can't teach high school English for 30 years without developing a deep appreciation for Shakespeare and Austen and Dickens. But I also think it's important to stay current with what young people are reading today. Some of the contemporary young adult authors are doing incredible work with complex themes." Richard nodded approvingly. That makes sense. You have to meet students where they are, right? Can't just force feed them dusty old books and expect them to develop a love of reading. Exactly, I said, forgetting my self-imposed restrictions for a moment. I used to start each semester with something contemporary that dealt with issues my students were actually facing: identity, family pressure, social justice, coming-of-age challenges. Once they were hooked on the story, I could introduce them to older works that explored similar themes. Smart approach, Richard said. What kinds of contemporary books worked best? I found myself warming to the subject despite my earlier caution. Well, books like The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas were incredibly powerful for starting discussions about social justice and finding your voice. Speak by Laurie Halls. Anderson helped students understand the importance of speaking up about difficult experiences. Wonder by R.J. Palacio taught empathy and acceptance of differences. Richard was listening intently, occasionally nodding or asking follow-up questions. Those sound like heavy topics for teenagers to tackle. Teenagers are dealing with heavy topics whether we acknowledge it or not, I replied. Literature gives them a safe space to explore difficult subjects and realize they're not alone in their struggles. It teaches them to think critically about the world around them and their place in it. That's a fascinating perspective, Richard said. Most people think of English class as just grammar and essay writing. I laughed, feeling more relaxed than I had all afternoon. Grammar and essay writing are important tools, but they're not the end goal. The real goal is helping young people develop empathy, critical thinking skills, and the confidence to express their ideas clearly. Literature is just the vehicle for getting there. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of Michael approaching our table. His expression was tense, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to figure out how to extract me from this conversation without being obvious about it. Richard, I see you've met my mother, Michael said, his voice carrying just a hint of strain. I hope she's not boring you with teacher stories. Richard looked up with a genuine smile. Boring? Quite the opposite. Your mother has been sharing some fascinating insights about education and literature. I had no idea there was so much strategy involved in choosing reading materials for teenagers. Michael forced a laugh. Well, she does tend to get passionate about books. Maybe a little too passionate sometimes. The comment stung, but Richard seemed oblivious to the underlying tension. Passion is a good thing, especially when it comes to education. Your mother clearly knows what she's talking about. I watched Michael's face carefully, looking for signs of how I was supposed to respond. But something had shifted in me during the conversation with Richard. For the first time in months, I'd been able to talk about something I cared deeply about without being made to feel like I was committing some social transgression. Richard had treated me like an intelligent adult with valuable insights, not like an embarrassing liability who needed to be managed. Actually, I said, looking directly at Richard while being acutely aware of Michael's growing discomfort. I've been thinking about starting a book club for adults who want to revisit some of the classics they might have missed or didn't appreciate when they were younger. There's something powerful about reading these works with the perspective that comes from life experience. Richard's eyes lit up. Now that's an intriguing idea. What classics were you thinking of including? Michael cleared his throat loudly. Mum, maybe we should let Richard get back to mingling with other families. But Richard waved him off. This is exactly the kind of mingling I want to do. Your mother is onto something here. He turned back to me. I never appreciated books like 1984 or To Kill a Mockingbird when I had to read them in high school. But reading them as an adult, especially in today's political climate, would probably be a completely different experience. That's exactly what I'm talking about, I said, feeling energized by his enthusiasm. Books like those take on new meaning when you've lived through your own experiences with authority, prejudice, and moral complexity. A 16-year-old reading about Atticus Finch sees a hero defending an innocent man. An adult might notice the paternalistic attitudes and the white savior complex that younger readers miss. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Layers of meaning that only become visible with experience. I love that concept. Michael was practically vibrating with tension beside us, but I found I didn't care. This conversation was reminding me of who I used to be. Someone who could engage with ideas, challenge assumptions, and contribute meaningfully to intellectual discussions. For months, I'd been allowing Michael and Sarah to shrink my world down to safe, superficial topics. But talking with Richard reminded me that there was nothing embarrassing about being knowledgeable and passionate about subjects that mattered. The book club idea sounds wonderful, Richard continued. Have you given any thought to where you'd hold meetings? I was thinking about approaching the public library, I said. They have community rooms available, and libraries are natural gathering places for people who love books. Plus, they often support educational programming for adults. Brilliant, Richard said. You know, my wife might be interested in something like that. She's been looking for more intellectual stimulation since she retired from teaching. Would you mind if I mentioned it to her? Before I could answer, Michael jumped in. Richard, that's very kind, but I'm not sure my mother has really thought this through completely. She's just in the early brainstorming stages. The dismissive tone in his voice was impossible to miss, and I saw Richard's eyebrows raise slightly. For the first time since the conversation began, an awkward silence fell over our table. Richard glanced between Michael and me, clearly sensing the undercurrent of tension, but not quite understanding its source. Well, Richard said carefully, it sounds like a thoughtful project to me. Eleanor, if you do decide to move forward with the book club, I'd love to hear how it develops. He stood up then, clearly recognizing that the family dynamics had shifted into uncomfortable territory. Michael, I'll see you Monday morning. We should set up that meeting to discuss the Riverside project timeline. He turned to me one more time. Eleanor, it was truly a pleasure meeting you. Don't let anyone discourage you from pursuing that book club idea. It's the kind of community programming we need more of. As Richard walked away, I felt Michael's eyes boring into me. Sarah had gone very quiet, focusing intently on cutting up Emma's hamburger into smaller pieces. The comfortable family atmosphere from earlier in the afternoon had evaporated, replaced by a tension so thick I could practically taste it. What was that about? Michael asked, his voice low but sharp. What was what about? I replied, genuinely confused by his anger. That whole performance, going on and on about books and teaching and your grand plans for a book club. I specifically asked you not to embarrass me, and you completely ignored what I said. I stared at my son, trying to process his words. How was I embarrassing you? Richard asked me questions, and I answered them. We had a perfectly normal conversation about literature and education. Normal? Michael's voice cracked slightly. Mum, you monopolized my boss for 20 minutes talking about controversial books and social justice and all your opinions about everything. That's exactly what I was worried about. Controversial books? I repeated, incredulous. Michael, I mentioned The Hate You Give and To Kill a Mockingbird. These aren't radical texts. They're widely taught in schools across the country. You don't understand, Michael said, running his hand through his hair in frustration. Richard is conservative. His company donates to Republican candidates. You can't just start spouting off about social justice and expect that to go over well. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Spouting off. I was discussing literature with someone who asked me direct questions about my teaching experience. I wasn't giving political speeches or trying to convert anyone to my world view. Sarah finally looked up from Emma's plate. Eleanor, I think what Michael is trying to say is that sometimes it's better to keep conversations light at work events. You know, stick to safer topics. Safer topics, I repeated slowly. Like what? The weather? Local restaurants? Should I pretend I never had a career or any interests beyond what you consider appropriately innocuous? Michael glanced around nervously, clearly worried that other families might overhear our conversation. Can we please not do this here? But I was past the point of caring about appearances. Something had crystallized during my conversation with Richard, a reminder of who I was before I started allowing my son to edit my personality for public consumption. Richard hadn't seemed embarrassed by my knowledge or my opinions. He'd seemed interested and engaged. The embarrassment was entirely Michael's creation. No, I said firmly. We're going to do this right here, right now, because I want to understand exactly what it is about me that you find so mortifying. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see Michael struggling with how to respond. He clearly hadn't expected me to push back so directly, especially not in public at his company picnic. Sarah was looking around nervously, probably calculating how many of Michael's colleagues might be within earshot of our increasingly tense conversation. "Mum, please," Michael said, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Can we talk about this later? At home?" "No," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I've been talking about this at home for months, Michael. I've been trying to understand why you seem ashamed of me, why you treat me like I'm some kind of social liability that needs to be managed and controlled. And you keep brushing me off, or changing the subject, or telling me I'm being too sensitive." Emma looked up from her plate, sensing the adult tension even if she didn't understand its source. "Grandma Eleanor, are you okay?" I reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups need to have important conversations, even when it's not the perfect time or place for them." Sarah immediately tried to redirect. "Emma, why don't you go see if there are any other kids by the playground?" But Emma stayed put, looking between her father and me with the kind of intuitive understanding that children often have about family dynamics. "Dad, why are you upset with Grandma?" Michael's face flushed red. "I'm not upset with Grandma. We're just having a discussion." "It doesn't sound like a discussion," Emma observed with 8-year-old honesty. "It sounds like you're mad at her. Out of the mouths of babes." I looked at my granddaughter and felt a surge of protective anger. This child was watching her father treat me with disrespect and dismissal. What lessons was she learning about how families should interact? About how young people should treat their elders? About whether women's voices and opinions mattered? "Your dad is frustrated with me," I told Emma honestly, "because he thinks I talk too much about things he considers inappropriate." "Eleanor," Sarah warned, clearly uncomfortable with my directness. "What kinds of things?" Emma asked, her curiosity overriding the adult's attempts to shut down the conversation. "Well," I said, maintaining eye contact with Michael while I spoke to Emma, "I talked to your dad's boss about books and teaching and education. Your dad thinks those topics are embarrassing." Michael's face went from red to white. "That's not what I said." "Then what did you say?" I asked. "Because your text message yesterday was very clear. Don't talk to my boss. You'll just say something embarrassing like you always do." Those were your exact words. Emma's eyes widened. "Dad, you said that to Grandma?" The shame on Michael's face was unmistakable, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "I was trying to protect both of us, Mom. You don't understand how corporate environments work. There are unwritten rules about what's appropriate to discuss and what isn't." "Enlighten me," I said. What unwritten rule did I break by discussing literature with a man who asked me direct questions about my teaching career? Michael glanced around the picnic again, clearly wishing this conversation was happening anywhere else. Several families at nearby tables were pretending not to listen, while obviously straining to catch our words. His colleagues were probably getting quite an education about his family dynamics. "It's not about any specific thing you said," Michael replied, his voice tight with frustration. "It's about knowing when to stop, when to keep things surface level, when not to get so deep into your personal opinions and theories." "My personal opinions and theories?" I repeated. "You mean my professional expertise developed over 30 years of teaching? My knowledge about literature and education? Those personal opinions?" Sarah tried to intervene again. "Maybe we could all take a break and get some dessert. I think I saw someone setting out a cake." But I wasn't ready to be redirected anymore. "No, Sarah. I want to hear Michael explain exactly what I did wrong." Because from where I sat, I had a pleasant conversation with a man who seemed genuinely interested in hearing about education and books. He asked follow-up questions. He engaged with my ideas. He even said his wife might be interested in my book club concept. "That's exactly the problem," Michael exploded, his voice rising despite his earlier concerns about public scenes. "The book club thing. You just invented this whole elaborate project on the spot and started involving my boss's wife. What if you can't follow through? What if it falls apart? What if it becomes some kind of obligation that creates awkwardness between me and Richard?" I stared at my son, trying to process the depth of his assumptions about my incompetence. "Michael, do you think I'm incapable of organizing a book club? I organized the entire literature curriculum for my high school department for 15 years. I coordinated professional development workshops for other teachers. I managed parent-teacher conferences, school board presentations, and community education events. But you think I can't handle organizing a group of adults to read and discuss books?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. I could see him struggling to articulate his concerns without explicitly stating that he thought I was unreliable or incompetent. "It's not that," he said finally. "It's just, you get these ideas, and you get excited about them, and sometimes you don't think through all the practical implications." "What practical implications?" I pressed. "What dire consequences do you imagine might result from me starting a book club?" Michael's frustration was palpable. "You don't understand the position you put me in. Richard is my boss. If you make commitments involving his wife, and then something goes wrong, that reflects on me. If you say something controversial during your book discussions, and it gets back to him, that affects my standing at work." There it was. The real issue wasn't my supposed social incompetence or my tendency toward inappropriate topics. The real issue was that Michael saw me as a potential threat to his career advancement. Every conversation I had, every opinion I expressed, every project I might undertake was viewed through the lens of how it might impact his professional reputation. "So your solution," I said slowly, "is for me to become a bland, generic version of myself, who never expresses any real thoughts or pursues any meaningful activities, just in case some remote possibility of awkwardness might theoretically reflect poorly on you." "That's not what I'm saying," Michael protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's exactly what you're saying," I replied. "You want me to be a safe, sanitized grandmother who talks about the weather and compliments people's casseroles and never, ever reveals that I have a brain or any interests beyond what you consider socially acceptable." Emma had been listening to this entire exchange with wide eyes, and now she spoke up with startling clarity. "But Grandma, you're smart, and you know lots of things. Why would Dad want you to pretend you don't?" The innocence of the question cut right to the heart of the matter. I looked at my granddaughter, then at Michael and Sarah. and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about my relationship with my son anymore. This was about what kind of role model I wanted to be for Emma. Did I want her to grow up thinking that women should minimize themselves to make others comfortable? That intelligence and passion were embarrassing qualities to be hidden away? I don't know, Emma, I said honestly, but I think it's important for you to understand that there's nothing wrong with being smart or curious or having strong interests in things you care about. Those are good qualities, and you should never let anyone make you feel ashamed of them. Michael's face went pale. Mum, don't drag Emma into this. I'm not dragging her into anything, I said. She's already in it. She's watching how her family treats each other. She's learning lessons about respect and communication and whether women's voices matter. What lessons do you think she's absorbing from this conversation? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Sarah reached for Emma's hand, clearly preparing to remove her from the increasingly uncomfortable situation. But Emma pulled away. I think Dad is being mean to Grandma, she said, with 8-year-old directness. And I don't understand why. Michael looked stricken. Whatever he'd expected from this confrontation, having his daughter call him out certainly wasn't part of the plan. Emma, I'm not being mean. Grandma and I are just having a disagreement about grown-up things. It sounds mean, Emma insisted. You're saying she embarrasses you, and she talks too much, and she shouldn't tell people about her ideas. That's mean. I felt a surge of pride in my granddaughter's moral clarity, even as my heart broke for the position she'd been put in. This child shouldn't have to defend her grandmother against her own father. She shouldn't have to witness this level of family dysfunction at what was supposed to be a fun company picnic. You're right, Emma, I said quietly. This conversation is getting too heated for a family event. But I want you to remember that it's okay to stand up for people you care about, even when it's uncomfortable. I stood up from the picnic table, suddenly exhausted by the entire situation. Michael, I think it's best if I go home now. Thank you for including me in today's event. Mum, wait, Michael said, panic creeping into his voice. Don't leave like this. People are watching. I looked around the picnic and realized he was right. Our family drama had become the afternoon's entertainment for a significant portion of his colleagues and their families. The irony was perfect. In his effort to prevent me from embarrassing him, Michael had created a scene far more awkward and attention-grabbing than any conversation about literature could ever have been. Yes, I said calmly, people are watching. And they just witnessed you publicly berating your mother for having an intelligent conversation with your boss. I wonder what they think of that. I leaned down to hug Emma goodbye. I love you, sweetheart. I'll call you this week about our next sleepover. As I walked toward the parking lot, I could hear Michael calling after me, but I didn't turn around. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the carefully edited version my son preferred, but the real me, opinionated, passionate, intellectually curious, and completely unashamed of any of those qualities. I drove home in a strange state of calm mixed with adrenaline. The confrontation at the picnic had been building for months, and now that it was out in the open, I felt oddly relieved. The pretense was over. Michael's true feelings about me were now clearly established, not just for me, but for Emma and Sarah and half of his workplace. My phone started buzzing before I even got home. Text messages from Michael. Mum, please call me. We need to talk about what happened. You can't just walk away like that. I turned the phone to silent and focused on driving. When I got home, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my garden, looking at those same roses I'd been tending that morning. Had it really been only a few hours since I'd received that initial text message? The day felt like a lifetime, and I felt like a different person than the one who'd carefully chosen her outfit to avoid embarrassing her son. The phone kept buzzing. Michael was clearly in full panic mode, probably realizing that his public meltdown at the company picnic wasn't going to reflect well on his professional image. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so sad. Around 6 o'clock, I finally turned the ringer back on. Almost immediately, the phone rang. It was Michael. "Mum, thank God," he said when I answered. "I've been trying to reach you for hours." "I saw your messages," I said calmly. "I needed some time to think." "Look, things got out of hand at the picnic," Michael began, his voice carrying the tone of someone trying to manage a crisis. "I think we were both stressed and said things we didn't mean." "I meant everything I said," I replied. "Did you?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, were you being honest when you said I embarrass you? When you said I talk too much and get too deep into my personal opinions? When you said I don't understand how to behave appropriately in social situations? Were you being honest about that? Or were you just stressed?" Michael was quiet for a long moment. "Mum, it's complicated." "No, it's not complicated at all," I said. "Either you're ashamed of who I am, or you're not. Either you think I'm a social liability, or you don't. Either you respect me as an intelligent adult, or you don't." "Of course I respect you," Michael protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then why did you text me yesterday warning me not to talk to your boss? Why did you assume I would say something embarrassing? Why did you interrupt our conversation multiple times and try to shut it down? Why did you dismiss my book club idea as something I hadn't thought through properly?" Each question hit like a hammer blow, and I could hear Michael struggling to formulate responses that didn't sound as bad as his actual behavior. "I was worried about the promotion," he said finally. "I've been working towards senior project manager for months, and I didn't want anything to jeopardize that opportunity." "What exactly did you think I might do or say that would jeopardize your promotion?" I asked. "Be specific." Michael's silence stretched on long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared that your boss might discover you have a mother who reads books and thinks about social issues. Scared that he might realize you come from a family where education and critical thinking are valued." What exactly was the terrifying scenario you were trying to prevent? "You don't understand the corporate world, Mom," Michael said, falling back on his familiar refrain. "Image matters. Perception matters. You can't just say whatever comes to mind." "I understand the corporate world better than you think," I replied. "Your father worked in corporate environments for 35 years. I attended countless company events, met dozens of his colleagues and supervisors, had conversations about everything from politics to philosophy to literature. Not once did anyone suggest that I was an embarrassment or that I should limit myself to discussing the weather." The comparison to his father seemed to hit home. David had always been proud of my intelligence, my curiosity, my ability to engage with people from all walks of life. He'd introduced me to his colleagues as my brilliant wife, Eleanor, and encouraged me to share my perspectives on whatever topics came up. The contrast with Michael's approach couldn't have been starker. "Dad was different," Michael said weakly. "No," I said firmly. "Dad respected me. Dad valued my intelligence and my opinions. Dad never once suggested that I should pretend to be less than I am in order to make him look good. That's the difference." I heard Michael take a shaky breath. "Mum, I don't want to fight with you. Can we please just figure out how to move past this?" "I'm not sure we can move past it," I said, and meant it. "Michael, today wasn't just about the picnic. Today was the culmination of months of you treating me like I'm some kind of liability to be managed. You've made me feel unwelcome in my own family, embarrassed about my interests and expertise. ashamed of qualities that I used to be proud of. That wasn't my intention, Michael said. But it was the result, I replied. And until you can acknowledge that, until you can understand why your behavior has been hurtful and disrespectful, I don't see how we can have a healthy relationship. What are you saying? Michael's voice cracked slightly. I'm saying that I need some time to think about what kind of relationship we can have going forward. I'm not going to continue pretending to be a bland, innocuous version of myself just to make you comfortable. I'm not going to let you edit my personality or police my conversations. And I'm certainly not going to let you teach Emma that women should minimize themselves to avoid making others uncomfortable. The mention of Emma seemed to shake something loose in Michael. Please don't drag Emma into our problems. Emma is already in our problems, I said. She watched her father publicly disrespect her grandmother today. She heard you dismiss my intelligence and my accomplishments. She saw you treat me like I was some kind of embarrassing burden. What do you think she learned from that? Michael was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and defeated. I messed up, didn't I? It was the first genuine acknowledgement I'd heard from him all day. Yes, I said simply. You did. How do I fix it? The question hung between us, and I realized I didn't have an easy answer. The damage wasn't just from today's confrontation. It was from months of accumulated dismissals, corrections, and attempts to reshape me into someone I wasn't. I don't know if you can fix it, I said honestly, but you could start by figuring out why you've been so ashamed of me. Because until you understand that, until you can honestly examine your own behavior, we're just going to keep having versions of this same fight. After I hung up, I sat in my garden until well after dark, thinking about everything that had happened. The phone rang several more times. Michael, then Sarah, then Michael again. But I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready for more conversations about managing the situation or smoothing things over. I needed time to process what had really happened today and what it meant for my relationship with my son. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text message. But this one wasn't from Michael or Sarah. It was from a number I didn't recognize. Miss Eleanor, this is Richard Martinez. I hope you don't mind that I got your number from the company directory. I wanted to reach out after today's events. My heart sank. This was it. The professional fallout Michael had been so worried about. His boss was going to tell me that my behavior at the picnic had been inappropriate, that I'd created an uncomfortable situation, that I should have known better than to engage in substantive conversation at a company event. I stared at the message for several minutes before finally texting back. Hello, Mr. Martinez. I apologize if anything about today's conversation was inappropriate. His response came quickly. Please, call me Richard, and you have nothing to apologize for. I wanted you to know that I found our conversation absolutely delightful. Your insights about education and literature were fascinating, and I've been thinking about them all afternoon. I read the message 3 times, certain I must be misunderstanding something. Richard continued. I also wanted to say that I was quite disturbed by the way the conversation ended. The disrespect you experienced was unacceptable, and I hope you know that it in no way reflected my opinion of you or our discussion. I sat in stunned silence, processing his words. Michael's boss, the man whose opinion my son had been so worried about, was telling me that he'd enjoyed our conversation and disapproved of how I'd been treated. The irony was almost too much to bear. I texted back. Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know. I meant what I said about my wife potentially being interested in your book club idea, Richard replied. If you do decide to move forward with it, I'd be happy to put you in touch with her. She's been looking for exactly that kind of intellectual engagement. Over the next few days, the messages and phone calls from Michael and Sarah continued, but their tone shifted as time went on. Initially, they seemed focused on damage control, making sure I wouldn't cause any more scenes or make things worse. But as it became clear that I wasn't going to simply apologize and pretend nothing had happened, their approach changed. Sarah called 3 days after the picnic, her voice carefully modulated in the way it got when she was trying to manage a difficult situation. "Eleanor, I think maybe we all need to sit down and have a calm conversation about what happened." "What would you like to talk about?" I asked. "Well, I think there might have been some misunderstandings," Sarah said diplomatically. "Michael feels terrible about how things escalated, and he's worried that you might have gotten the wrong impression about his feelings toward you." "What impression should I have gotten?" I asked. Because from where I sat, Michael made his feelings quite clear. Sarah was quiet for a moment, probably recalibrating her approach. "He's under a lot of pressure at work right now with the promotion opportunity. Sometimes when people are stressed, they don't communicate as well as they usually do." It was a generous interpretation, but it didn't address the fundamental issue. "Sarah, this wasn't just about one stressful conversation. This has been building for months. Michael has been consistently treating me like I'm some kind of social embarrassment that needs to be managed." "That's not how he sees it," Sarah said carefully. "Then how does he see it?" Another long pause. "He says he was trying to protect you from potentially uncomfortable situations." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Protect me? By warning me not to speak to his boss? By interrupting me when I was having a perfectly pleasant conversation? By dismissing my ideas and treating me like I'm incompetent? "Eleanor, I think you might be taking some of this more personally than it was intended." There it was. The suggestion that my response was an overreaction, that I was being too sensitive, that the problem wasn't Michael's behavior, but my interpretation of it. It was a familiar pattern, one I'd been falling into for months. "Sarah," I said firmly, "when someone tells you repeatedly that you embarrass them, when they police your conversations and dismiss your ideas, when they treat you like you can't be trusted to behave appropriately in social situations, that is personal. That's not a misunderstanding or a communication problem. That's disrespect." The conversation ended without resolution, and I realized that Sarah was as invested in maintaining the status quo as Michael was. Neither of them wanted to acknowledge that there might be something fundamentally wrong with how they'd been treating me. They wanted me to accept their version of reality, that I was the problem, that my expectations were unreasonable, that I should be grateful for their efforts to protect me from myself. But something had changed in me during that conversation with Richard Martinez. For 20 minutes, I'd been reminded of who I really was, an intelligent, articulate woman with valuable insights and interesting ideas. Someone worth listening to, worth engaging with, worth respecting. The contrast with how my own family treated me was stark and undeniable. A week after the picnic, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called the public library and inquired about their community programming. The librarian I spoke with was enthusiastic about the book club idea and immediately offered to help me set up meetings and promote the group. Within an hour, I had reserved a conference room for the first Thursday of every month and started drafting a description of what I had in mind. That evening, I texted Richard Martinez. "I wanted you to know that I've decided to move forward with the book club. If your wife is interested, our first meeting will be next Thursday at 7 p.m. at the main branch of the public library." His response was immediate. "That's wonderful news. I'll have my wife contact you directly. Thank you for following through on such a great idea." I stared at his message, struck by the contrast between his encouragement and my family's dismissal. A man I'd met once at a company picnic had more faith in my ability to organize a successful book club than my own son did. The book club exceeded every expectation I'd had for it. Richard's wife, Margaret, was indeed interested and became one of our most dedicated members. She brought two friends from her former teaching colleagues, and word spread from there. By our third meeting, we had 12 regular attendees, ranging in age from their 30s to their 70s, representing a diverse mix of backgrounds and perspectives. We started with To Kill a Mockingbird, and Margaret had been right about how differently we experienced the book as adults. The discussions were rich, complex, and sometimes heated as we grappled with issues of racism, moral courage, and the complexities of hero worship. Several members commented that they'd never realized how much they'd missed when they read the book as teenagers. Our second selection was 1984, which proved eerily relevant to current political discussions. The conversations about surveillance, truth, and authoritarianism were so engaging that we regularly ran over our scheduled meeting time, with members lingering in the library lobby to continue their debates. Michael knew about the book club. I'd mentioned it during one of our stilted phone conversations, but he never asked for details or expressed any interest in how it was going. The contrast with Richard's genuine enthusiasm was impossible to ignore. About 6 weeks after the picnic, Richard stopped by one of our meetings. He didn't stay for the discussion, but he introduced himself to the group and thanked me publicly for creating such a valuable community resource. "My wife comes home from these meetings energized and full of ideas," he told the group. "This is exactly the kind of intellectual engagement our community needs more of." Several members approached me after he left to comment on what a thoughtful and supportive boss I must have in my family. I didn't have the heart to tell them that Richard wasn't family, that he was, in fact, more supportive of my endeavors than my actual son had ever been. The success of the book club began to shift something in how I saw myself and my place in the world. For months, I'd been allowing Michael and Sarah to convince me that my interests were inappropriate, my opinions too strong, my social skills somehow deficient. But the book club proved otherwise. Here was a group of intelligent adults who valued my insights, who looked forward to our discussions, who saw me as a capable leader worth following. Meanwhile, my relationship with Michael remained strained. We spoke on the phone once or twice a week, but our conversations were careful and surface level. He never brought up the events at the picnic, never acknowledged how his behavior had hurt me, never apologized for the months of making me feel ashamed of who I was. Instead, he seemed to be waiting for me to get over it, to return to the accommodating version of myself that didn't challenge his comfort level. Emma was the casualty in all of this. Michael and Sarah had significantly reduced the frequency of our visits, claiming scheduling conflicts and busy weekends. When I did see Emma, there was always supervision, Sarah staying close by to monitor our conversations, Michael ready to redirect if I strayed into territory they considered inappropriate. The impact on Emma was visible. She seemed more subdued during our visits, less likely to ask the probing questions that had always characterized our relationship. I could see her watching the adults, trying to navigate the unspoken tensions and restrictions. It broke my heart to watch this intelligent, curious child learning to censor herself to keep the peace. 3 months after the picnic, Emma had a school project about family history. She needed to interview older family members about their experiences and careers. When she called to ask if I would participate, I was thrilled. Finally, an opportunity to have a real conversation with my granddaughter about something substantial. We set up a video call for the interview, and Emma came prepared with thoughtful questions about my teaching career, the changes I'd seen in education over the decades, and the books and authors who had influenced me most. It was exactly the kind of conversation we used to have naturally, before her parents decided that my influence needed to be managed. Emma was engaged and curious, asking follow-up questions and taking notes like a serious journalist. We talked about the importance of literature in helping people understand different perspectives, about the challenges and rewards of working with teenagers, about how education had evolved during my career. It felt like reconnecting with the granddaughter I'd been missing for months. Near the end of our call, Emma asked a question that caught me off guard. "Grandma, why don't you and Dad seem to get along anymore?" The question was so direct and perceptive that I had to take a moment to formulate an appropriate response. "What makes you think we don't get along, sweetheart? You used to come over for dinner all the time, and now you hardly ever come. And when you do come, everyone seems tense. Dad acts weird, like he's worried about what you might say. And Mom watches you like she's waiting for something bad to happen." Emma's 8-year-old observations were devastatingly accurate. She'd noticed all the changes in family dynamics that the adults were pretending didn't exist. "Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements about important things," I said carefully, trying to be honest without being inappropriate. "Your dad and I see some things differently, and we're still trying to figure out how to work through that." "Is it because you're too smart?" Emma asked, and the question nearly knocked the breath out of me. "What do you mean?" "I heard Dad tell Mom that you make him feel stupid sometimes because you know so much about books and teaching and stuff. Is that why he gets upset when you talk about those things?" I sat in stunned silence, processing what Emma had just revealed. Michael had apparently discussed his feelings about me with Sarah, and Emma had overheard enough to understand that her father felt threatened by my knowledge and expertise. The realization was both heartbreaking and infuriating. "Emma," I said carefully, "being smart or knowledgeable is never something to apologize for. If someone feels bad about themselves because you know things they don't know, that's not your fault or your responsibility. You should never make yourself smaller or less intelligent to make other people feel better." Emma nodded seriously, absorbing this advice. "So you're not going to stop being smart just because it makes Dad uncomfortable?" The question was so innocent and so profound that I had to smile. "No, sweetheart. I'm not going to stop being smart. And I hope you never stop being smart either, no matter what anyone else thinks about it." After our call ended, I sat thinking about Emma's revelation. Michael felt stupid around me. His discomfort with my intelligence and expertise wasn't just about professional appearances or social appropriateness. It was about his own insecurities. Somehow, instead of feeling proud that he had a knowledgeable, articulate mother, he felt diminished by comparison. The insight reframed everything that had happened over the past several months. Michael's attempts to limit my conversations, his dismissal of my ideas, his warnings about embarrassing him. They weren't really about protecting his professional image. They were about protecting his ego from the discomfort of feeling intellectually inadequate next to his own mother. I thought about David, and how different his response had always been. When I knew more than he did about a particular subject, when I could contribute insights he couldn't, when I engaged in discussions that showcased my expertise, David felt proud. He would brag about my knowledge to his friends, encourage me to share my perspectives, actively seek out my opinions on complex topics. My intelligence enhanced him rather than threatening him. The contrast was painful, but clarifying. Michael's problem with me wasn't really about me at all. It was about his own relationship with intellectual confidence and his inability to be comfortable with family members who might know more than he did in certain areas. Armed with this understanding, I made another decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I called Michael and asked him to meet me for coffee. Not at home where Sarah might hover, not somewhere Emma might overhear, but in a neutral public space where we could have an honest conversation about what had really been happening between us. Michael looked nervous when he walked into the coffee shop. We'd barely spoken since the book club had started, and when we did talk, it was stilted and careful. He probably expected another confrontation, more accusations, or demands for apologies. Instead, I'd simply asked if we could talk, and he'd reluctantly agreed. "How's the book club going?" he asked as we settled into a corner table making what I assumed was an attempt at polite conversation. "It's going very well," I replied. "We have a strong core group, great discussions, and we're already planning our selections for the next several months." Michael nodded awkwardly, clearly unsure how to respond. He'd probably expected the book club to fizzle out after a few weeks, proving his point about my tendency to start projects I couldn't sustain. "That's good," he said unconvincingly. "Your boss speaks very highly of it," I added, watching Michael's face carefully. "Richard stops by occasionally to thank me for organizing it. He says Margaret comes home energized by our discussions." Michael's expression tightened slightly. "That's nice." "He's been very supportive of the whole project," I continued. "Much more supportive than my own family, actually." The comment hit its target. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat, finally looking directly at me. "Mum, what is this about? You said you wanted to talk, so talk." "I talked to Emma last week for her school project," I said. "She interviewed me about my teaching career." "I know." "Sarah helped her prepare the questions. Emma asked me why you and I don't seem to get along anymore." Michael's face flushed slightly. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that sometimes grown-ups have disagreements about important things," I said. "But then she said something very interesting. She said she'd heard you tell Sarah that I make you feel stupid sometimes because I know so much about books and teaching." The flush on Michael's face deepened to a bright red. "She wasn't supposed to hear that." "But you did say it." Michael looked down at his coffee cup, unable to meet my eyes. "It's not what it sounds like." "What does it sound like?" "Like I'm some kind of jealous child who can't handle having a smart mother." I waited for him to continue, but he seemed to be struggling with how to articulate his feelings. Finally, I decided to help him. "Michael," I said gently, "do you remember when you were in high school and you were struggling with your English classes?" He looked up, surprised by the apparent change of subject. "Yeah? Why? Do you remember what I did to help you?" "You tutored me. You helped me understand the books we were reading and how to write better essays." "Did I ever make you feel stupid during those tutoring sessions?" Michael considered the question. "Number you were patient. You explained things in ways that made sense to me. Did I ever suggest that you were less intelligent because literature didn't come as naturally to you as it did to me?" Number. "Did I ever imply that your strengths in math and science were less valuable than my strengths in English and reading?" Michael shook his head slowly, beginning to see where I was going with this line of questioning. "So when did you start feeling like my knowledge and expertise were somehow threatening to you?" I asked. "When did you start seeing my intelligence as something that diminished you, rather than something that could complement your different strengths?" Michael was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and sad. "I don't know. Somewhere along the way, I started feeling like I could never measure up." "Measure up to what?" "To your expectations. To your level of education and sophistication. To the way you can talk about books and ideas and make everything sound so profound and meaningful." The admission was heartbreaking in its honesty. "Michael, when did I ever give you the impression that you needed to measure up to me in those areas? When did I ever suggest that your worth as a person was tied to your ability to discuss literature?" "You didn't," he said quietly. "It was all in my head." "Then why did you start treating me like I was the problem? Why did you start trying to silence me instead of dealing with your own insecurities?" Michael looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "Because it was easier to blame you than to face the fact that I felt inadequate. It was easier to tell myself that you were inappropriate or embarrassing than to admit that I was intimidated by my own mother." The confession hung between us like a bridge we could either cross or leave unfinished. I felt a mixture of sadness for the pain he'd been carrying and anger about how he'd chosen to handle it. Michael, your father was a brilliant man in his own right, I said. He was talented at mathematics, engineering, problem solving, project management, areas where I had no expertise at all. But he never felt threatened when I knew more than he did about education or literature. He felt proud. He would introduce me to people as his brilliant wife and encourage me to share my perspectives on whatever we were discussing. Dad was more secure than I am, Michael said. Security isn't something you're born with, I replied. It's something you develop by facing your insecurities instead of trying to make them everyone else's problem. Michael nodded, accepting the rebuke. You're right. I've been making my problem your problem, and that's not fair. It's not just unfair to me, I said. It's unfair to Emma. She's watching how you treat me, and she's learning lessons about whether women's intelligence should be celebrated or hidden. She's learning whether family members should support each other's strengths or tear them down. The mention of Emma seemed to hit Michael harder than anything else I'd said. He put his head in his hands, and I could see his shoulders shaking slightly. I've screwed this up so badly, he said, his voice muffled. Yes, you have, I agreed, not willing to minimize the damage for the sake of making him feel better. The question is, what you're going to do about it. Michael looked up at me, his eyes red but determined. Tell me what I need to do to fix this. You need to stop seeing me as a threat to your ego and start seeing me as your mother who loves you and wants to support you, I said. You need to stop trying to manage my personality and start appreciating the woman who raised you to be thoughtful and curious. You need to stop worrying about whether I might embarrass you and start worrying about whether you're embarrassing yourself. Michael winced at the last comment, but he nodded. Anything else? You need to apologize to Emma for putting her in the middle of our problems and for teaching her that intelligence is something to be ashamed of, I said. And you need to figure out how to model the kind of respect and support that you want her to expect from the people in her life. What about Sarah? Michael asked. She's been part of this too. Sarah has been following your lead, I said. When you change your behavior, she'll adjust accordingly. But this has to start with you acknowledging that the problem wasn't my behavior. It was your reaction to my behavior. Michael sat quietly for several minutes, processing everything I'd said. Finally, he looked up at me with something approaching his old smile. I've missed you, Mum. The real you, not the edited version I was trying to create. I've missed you too, I said honestly. But Michael, I need you to understand that I'm not going back to being that edited version. I'm not going to pretend to be less intelligent or less curious or less opinionated than I am. If you can't handle that, then we need to figure out what kind of limited relationship we can have. I don't want a limited relationship, Michael said quickly. I want my mum back. The mum who taught me to think critically and ask hard questions and never accept easy answers. The mum who made me feel proud to be her son. The conversation marked a turning point, but it wasn't an instant fix. Relationships that have been damaged by months of accumulated hurt don't heal overnight. Michael had to practice responding to me differently, catching himself when he fell back into old patterns of trying to manage or redirect my conversations. Sarah had to learn to see me as an ally rather than a potential embarrassment. And I had to learn to trust that the changes were genuine and lasting. The real test came at Emma's school play 2 months later. It was a production about famous women in history, and Emma was playing Marie Curie. After the performance, several parents approached me to ask about the book club, having heard about it from Margaret Martinez or other members. One parent wanted to know if we'd consider doing a summer reading program for families. Another asked if I'd be interested in leading a discussion group about banned books at the library. I watched Michael's face carefully as these conversations unfolded, looking for signs of the old discomfort and embarrassment. Instead, I saw him listening with genuine interest, even contributing information about my teaching background when it seemed relevant. When one parent complimented my organization of the book club, Michael said, "My mum has always been great at bringing people together around ideas. It's one of her many talents." Later that evening, as we were driving home from the school, Michael turned to me and said, "I'm sorry it took me so long to remember who you really are." "I never forgot who you really are," I replied. "I just had to wait for you to remember too." Looking back on everything that happened, from that first hurtful text message to the gradual rebuilding of our relationship, I've learned some important lessons about family dynamics, self-respect, and the courage to stand up for who you are. The most painful realization was that I had allowed my son's insecurities to diminish me. For months, I'd been editing myself, monitoring my conversations, suppressing my interests and expertise, because I'd accepted his narrative that these qualities were somehow inappropriate or embarrassing. I'd let him convince me that being intelligent, curious, and opinionated were character flaws rather than strengths. But the conversation with Richard Martinez at that company picnic reminded me of something crucial. There was nothing wrong with me. The problem wasn't my knowledge of literature, or my passion for education, or my tendency to engage deeply with ideas. The problem was that my own son had become uncomfortable with his mother's intelligence and had chosen to address that discomfort by trying to silence me rather than examining his own feelings of inadequacy. The book club became more than just a social activity. It became proof that I had valuable contributions to make, that people genuinely enjoyed engaging with my ideas, that my expertise and insights were worth sharing. Every Thursday evening, I was reminded of who I really was beneath the diminished version I'd been performing for my family. Emma's role in this whole situation taught me something important about the ripple effects of family dysfunction. Children are always watching, always learning lessons about relationships and respect and self-worth. When Michael treated me with dismissal and condescension, Emma was absorbing messages about how intelligence should be valued, how family members should treat each other, and whether women's voices matter. The damage wasn't just to my relationship with my son, it was potentially to my granddaughter's understanding of her own worth and potential. Michael's eventual honesty about feeling intimidated by my knowledge was both heartbreaking and enlightening. It explained so much about his behavior, but it also highlighted a troubling pattern in how some people respond to feeling intellectually insecure. Instead of using those feelings as motivation to grow or learn, instead of appreciating the opportunity to be exposed to different perspectives and expertise, Michael had chosen to tear me down in an attempt to build himself up. The contrast with his father's approach was stark and instructive. David had never felt threatened by my strengths in areas where he had less knowledge. Instead, he'd felt proud and supportive, recognizing that our different areas of expertise complemented rather than competed with each other. He understood that intelligence isn't a zero-sum game. My knowledge didn't diminish his worth, and his abilities didn't diminish mine. Richard Martinez's response to our conversation proved that Michael's concerns about professional appropriateness were largely unfounded. A successful business owner had found our discussion about literature and education engaging and valuable. He'd encouraged my book club project and introduced me to his wife. The apocalyptic professional consequences that Michael had feared never materialized because they were never realistic possibilities. The rebuilding of our relationship required Michael to do the hard work of examining his own insecurities and changing his behavior. It wasn't enough for him to simply apologize or promise to do better. He had to actually demonstrate respect for who I am, including the aspects of my personality that had made him uncomfortable. He had to learn to see my intelligence as an asset rather than a threat, my opinions as valuable contributions rather than embarrassing liabilities. Sarah's role in supporting and enabling Michael's behavior was also instructive. She'd gone along with his attempts to manage and edit me, presumably because it was easier than challenging his insecurities or defending my right to be myself. Her complicity reminded me that bystanders in family dysfunction bear some responsibility for perpetuating harmful dynamics, even when they're not the primary instigators. The most important lesson from this entire experience is that you cannot sacrifice your authentic self to manage other people's insecurities and discomfort. When you allow others to edit your personality, silence your voice, or diminish your contributions to make themselves feel better, you're not being kind or accommodating. You're enabling dysfunction and teaching them that their comfort matters more than your dignity. Standing up for yourself in family relationships is particularly challenging because there's so much history, so many competing loyalties, so much pressure to keep the peace. But sometimes keeping the peace comes at too high a cost. Sometimes the only way to preserve your self-respect and model healthy boundaries for the next generation is to refuse to accept unacceptable treatment, even from people you love. The success of the book club, the positive response from Richard Martinez, and the eventual repair of my relationship with Michael all proved that the problem had never been with me. The problem had been with a family dynamic that prioritized one person's insecurities over everyone else's right to be authentic and respected. Emma is thriving now in ways that make me proud and hopeful. She's curious and articulate, asking probing questions about everything from current events to historical figures to scientific discoveries. She no longer seems to be monitoring herself for appropriateness or watching the adults for signs that she should tone down her intelligence. She's learning that knowledge is something to celebrate, that different people have different strengths to contribute, and that family members should support and encourage each other's growth rather than trying to diminish each other. Michael has grown too, becoming more secure in his own abilities and more appreciative of the different strengths that each family member brings. He asks me for advice about work challenges now, recognizing that my years of experience managing people and projects have given me insights that might be valuable. He encourages Emma's curiosity and celebrates her intelligence in ways that remind me of how his father used to celebrate mine. The book club continues to thrive, with new members joining regularly and our discussions becoming more sophisticated and engaging. We've tackled challenging books, Beloved, The Handmaid's Tale, The Kite Runner, and our conversations have been rich with diverse perspectives and deep analysis. Several members have told me that the club has rekindled their love of reading and given them a community of intellectually curious people they wouldn't have found otherwise. Richard Martinez still stops by occasionally, and he always takes time to thank me for creating such a valuable community resource. His continued support and encouragement serve as a reminder that there are people in the world who appreciate intelligence, curiosity, and the willingness to engage deeply with ideas. The contrast with how I was being treated by my own family during those difficult months remains a powerful reminder of how differently people can respond to the same qualities. Looking forward, I'm committed to never again allowing anyone, family member or otherwise, to convince me that my intelligence, knowledge, or opinions are embarrassing or inappropriate. I've learned that the people who truly care about me will celebrate my strengths rather than asking me to hide them. And I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their worst impulses, even when that refusal creates temporary conflict. The roses in my garden are blooming again this spring, just as they have every year through all the changes and challenges in my life. They remind me that some things endure through difficult seasons, that growth and beauty can emerge from periods of dormancy, and that tending something carefully and consistently yields rewards that are worth the effort. My relationship with my family has emerged stronger from this trial, built now on a foundation of genuine respect rather than careful management. Emma is learning lessons about self-worth, family loyalty, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Michael has developed greater emotional maturity and security in his own abilities, and I have reclaimed my voice, my confidence, and my right to be fully myself in all areas of my life. The most important thing I want others to understand from my experience is this: you don't have to make yourself smaller to accommodate other people's insecurities. You don't have to dim your light so that others feel more comfortable in their darkness. You don't have to apologize for being knowledgeable, curious, passionate, or articulate. If someone in your life, whether it's a family member, friend, or colleague, is trying to convince you that your strengths are actually weaknesses, that your voice is too loud, that your ideas are inappropriate, that your very presence is somehow embarrassing, the problem is not with you. The problem is with their inability to handle your authentic self. Family relationships are complicated, and there's always pressure to maintain harmony and avoid conflict. But harmony built on one person's diminishment is not real harmony. It's dysfunction disguised as peace. True family love celebrates each member's unique gifts and encourages everyone to be their fullest, most authentic selves. I think about the months I spent editing myself, monitoring my conversations, suppressing my interests and expertise, and I feel sad for the time I lost trying to be someone I wasn't. I think about Emma watching those interactions and learning that women should minimize themselves to make others comfortable. And I feel grateful that we interrupted that pattern before it became her permanent understanding of how relationships should work. The book club taught me something valuable about community and belonging. When you find your tribe, people who appreciate your mind, who engage with your ideas, who celebrate your contributions, you remember who you really are. You remember that the voice you've been told to quiet is actually worth hearing. You remember that the interests you've been told to hide are actually worth sharing. You remember that you have value exactly as you are. Michael's journey from seeing me as a threat to seeing me as a source of pride reminds me that people can change when they're willing to do the hard work of examining their own insecurities. But that change has to come from within. You can't love someone into respecting you, and you can't diminish yourself into earning their approval. The conversation at that company picnic changed everything because it reminded me of a fundamental truth I'd temporarily forgotten. I am not responsible for managing other people's discomfort with who I am. I am not required to make myself smaller so that others can feel bigger. I am not obligated to hide my strengths to protect someone else's ego. Richard Martinez treated me with the kind of respect that should be normal in family relationships: genuine interest in my thoughts, appreciation for my expertise, encouragement for my projects. The fact that a relative stranger showed me more support than my own son had been showing me was a wake-up call about what I was accepting as normal. Emma's innocent questions cut right to the heart of everything that was wrong with our family dynamics. Why would Dad want you to pretend you don't know things? Out of the mouths of babes. Children see through adult pretenses and politeness to the core issues. They understand fairness and respect in ways that adults sometimes forget. Today, our family gatherings are completely different from those tense affairs of 2 years ago. Michael asks me about the book club and genuinely listens to my descriptions of our discussions. Sarah engages with my opinions instead of trying to redirect conversations to safer topics. Emma freely asks me questions about everything from literature to current events to life experiences, knowing that her curiosity will be welcomed rather than discouraged. The book club has evolved beyond my original vision. We now have a waiting list of people who want to join, and several members have started their own specialized groups: a poetry discussion circle, a contemporary fiction book club, and a non-fiction group focused on biographies and memoirs. Margaret Martinez has become one of my closest friends, and we often meet for coffee between book club meetings to discuss whatever we're reading individually. Richard still mentions the book club occasionally when he sees me at family events or community gatherings. You started something special, he told me recently. Margaret says it's the highlight of her month. The validation from someone whose opinion Michael respects has been healing in ways I didn't expect. But the most meaningful validation comes from seeing Emma grow into a confident, articulate young woman who isn't afraid to express her ideas or ask difficult questions. She's learned that intelligence is something to be proud of, that different people have different strengths to contribute, and that family members should lift each other up rather than tear each other down. Sometimes I think about that text message that started this whole journey. Please don't talk to my boss. You'll just say something embarrassing like you always do. It seems almost laughable now, but at the time it cut deep because it confirmed fears I'd been developing about my place in my own family. The irony is that the thing Michael was most worried about, me embarrassing him in front of his boss, never happened. What did happen was that his boss found me interesting and engaging and supportive of my endeavors. The real embarrassment came from Michael's public meltdown at the company picnic, his inability to handle a normal conversation between adults, his obvious discomfort with his own mother's intelligence. But that embarrassment led to the honest conversations we needed to have, the examination of his insecurities that he needed to undertake, and the growth that ultimately strengthened our relationship. I've learned that standing up for yourself isn't always comfortable or convenient. There are moments when it would be easier to just go along with others' attempts to diminish you, to avoid conflict by accepting unacceptable treatment. But those moments of temporary discomfort are nothing compared to the long-term damage of allowing others to convince you that you're too much, too loud, too smart, too opinionated, too anything. The woman who received that text message 2 years ago had been slowly disappearing, editing herself out of existence to accommodate her family's discomfort with who she was. The woman writing this today has reclaimed her voice, her confidence, and her right to take up space in the world. The difference is profound and permanent. My advice to anyone facing similar family dynamics is this: don't negotiate with people who want you to be less than you are. Don't make yourself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't designed for your full self. Don't apologize for gifts that make others uncomfortable. Find your community, use your voice, pursue your passions, and trust that the people who truly love you will learn to celebrate your strengths rather than asking you to hide them. The roses in my garden are in full bloom now, more beautiful than they've been in years. I tend them carefully, giving them the water and nutrients they need to thrive, pruning away dead growth to make room for new blossoms. It's a good metaphor for what I've learned about nurturing relationships. Some things need to be cut away so that healthy growth can flourish. My relationship with Michael is healthier now because we removed the toxic dynamic that was poisoning it. Emma is thriving because she's no longer caught in the middle of adult dysfunction. The book club is successful because it's built on genuine appreciation for learning and growth rather than on managing everyone's comfort levels. I think about that company picnic often, not with regret, but with gratitude. That day forced all of us to confront truths we'd been avoiding. It brought our family dysfunction into the open where it could be addressed, rather than allowing it to continue festering beneath polite surfaces. It reminded me who I really am, and gave me the courage to insist on being treated accordingly. The most important lesson from this entire experience is that you teach people how to treat you. When you accept dismissal, you get more dismissal. When you accept disrespect, you get more disrespect. But when you insist on being valued for who you truly are, when you refuse to edit yourself to manage others' insecurities, when you stand firm in your worth, that's when real relationships become possible. Today, I am fully myself in all areas of my life. I lead book discussions with confidence, engage in political conversations without apology, share my educational expertise without embarrassment, and pursue intellectual interests without seeking anyone's permission. I am the same woman I was before that difficult period with Michael began. I just refuse to pretend otherwise anymore. The book club continues to grow and evolve. Emma continues to flourish as a thoughtful, curious young woman. Michael continues to develop greater security in his own abilities and appreciation for others' strengths. Our family continues to heal and strengthen, built now on a foundation of authentic respect rather than careful management. And I continue to tend my roses, watching them bloom year after year, reminded that some things endure through every season if you care for them properly and refuse to let anyone convince you they're not worth nurturing. The woman who wrote this story is not the same woman who received that hurtful text message 2 years ago. She's stronger, clearer, and completely unwilling to dim her light for anyone's comfort ever again. That's the real victory in all of this. Not that my son learned to appreciate me, not that my book club succeeded, not that his boss respected our conversation, though all of those things mattered. The real victory is that I remembered who I am and decided that person was worth defending. Everything else followed from that fundamental choice to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. If you're reading this and recognizing your own situation, if someone in your life is trying to convince you that you're too much, too smart, too opinionated, too anything, please hear this. You are not too much. You are exactly enough. The right people will celebrate what makes you unique rather than asking you to hide it. And if the people in your life can't handle your authentic self, the problem is not with you. Stand firm. Use your voice. Take up space. Be gloriously, unapologetically yourself. The world needs what you have to offer, and the people who truly matter will love you not despite your strengths, but because of them.